Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Productions channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another Album of the Week video. This is episode number 219. Today, I am here to finally celebrate the 40th anniversary for All For One, the classic third album from new wave of British heavy metal legends, Raven. Originally released through both Neat Records in the UK and Megaforce Records here in the United States in August of 1983. So with all that said, let's begin. After striking again with their second album, Wiped Out, they were shooting off like a speeding bullet by being taken on tours with both Motorhead and Girls' School. Soon, the American tour began on October 30th, when Raven was booked to play at the Great Headbangers Ball, which was held at the St. George Theater in Staten Island, New York, which had them play with both Anvil and Riot. And from there, Raven and Anvil began their tour together. This got the eyes of Megaforce Record founder John Zazula, who would champion for Raven. Eventually, Raven and Johnny Z would both partner up, to which would lead to a record contract. But before Raven could even sign any deal with Johnny Z's Megaforce, Raven were still contractually obligated to Neat Records. Raven were, of course, writing new material for what would be their third record. But for them to record any of these new songs, they made a special request to Neat to go outside of their in-house studio Impulse and their producers. Raven had a producer of choosing in their mind, that producer being Michael Wagner, who was just making a name for himself. They remember seeing his name on Accept's Breaker album. They were also surprised to know that both Wagner and Dirk Schneider were teamed as Double Trouble. Raven immediately remembered the time when they played with Accept, so this was an easy decision to make. Michael Wagner and Udo Dirk Schneider agreed to Raven, and they would head to London to record at Pineapple Studios. About 14 songs were recorded, with eventually 10 being chosen for the album, with 2 of the leftover songs to be used for a special single release that saw Udo Dirk Schneider team up with Raven for an insane cover of Born to Be Wild and a redo of one of Raven's classic tracks, Inquisitor. By the way, that's my favorite version of that song. You know, I do have to mention that it seems like whenever I listen to that version of Inquisitor, I swear what comes to my mind is that when you're thinking of classic Raven songs that would fit Udo Dirk Schneider's voice, you know, in a way, Inquisitor isn't really the first song that really comes to mind, but it's when listening to that version of Inquisitor is when you start to realize, oh yeah, this really was the perfect song for Udo Dirk Schneider because of, especially for his parts when he comes on, because it's usually a duet between Udo Dirk Schneider and John Gallagher. You know, that they are usually trading off, and it's with Udo's parts where you just start to realize, yeah, it makes more sense, you know, why that song was chosen. So, you know, I just had to let that out there. So, there we go. Then the other track being the Ballad of Marshall Stack, which would be used for selective 12-inch single releases for the track Break the Chain. The final leftover, The Power and the Glory, would not be used till Raven's next album. where it would be re-recorded entirely. That being Stay Hard. By August of 1983, All For One would be unleashed and becoming one of the first albums that Neat Records would release that was not recorded at the label's own Impulse Studios. The next two would be Axe Switch's Visions of the Past and Artillery's Fear of Tomorrow. The album would be met with 50-50 responses. This, of course, would end up being their final studio album for Neat Records, before jumping to Megaforce and then afterwards Atlantic Records. So, featuring 10 tracks, clocking in at the length of 40 minutes and 52 seconds, these 10 tracks are, of course, beginning with Take Control, Mind Over Metal, Sledgehammer Rock, the title track, Run Silent, Run Deep, Hung, Drawn, and Quartered, Break the Chain, Take It Away, Seek and Destroy, and then finally ending with Athletic Rock. So there you go, folks. There's your 10 tracks. While the album was met with a warm reception from its fans, however, the critics were not, with Jeff Barton describing that the band are too fast, too breathless, too extreme for their own good. Raven's so-called athletic rock may make Seb Coe look positively sloth-like. But what's the point in circling the track with all the style and thoughtfulness of an electric rabbit being chased at White City? For someone who championed for the new wave of British heavy metal, hell, coining the name new wave of British heavy metal, the NWOBHM, you know, that felt pretty blindsided coming from him, if you ask me. If anything, he got it wrong. Listen, this is Raven, and he should have known that. This was the last album, of course, before Atlantic got a hold of him, but even with that said, the way Jeff made this out, to me, in a way, does not apply to this album. This was seen as an updated take on what they were doing before. This time with a genuine metal producer who understands metal and how it's supposed to be presented on record. Not to say that I don't like any of the other Neat Records, you know, the Impulse Studios sound. It is iconic. It's what makes the new wave or British heavy metal, you know, sound like the new wave or British heavy metal. But if we're going to go talk about at least the technicals and shit about what's the proper way for a metal record to actually sound a true heavy metal record, then to me, Michael Wagner's production sound and his style, to me, is just one of those key elements and one of those factors to me that makes heavy metal sound like heavy metal. You know what I'm getting at with that, you know? But this wasn't as fast as Jeff made it out to be. But this was still Raven in fine form. You know, I've now just began listening to this album, having been spending weeks listening to it and not years like with the classic first two, the Mad EP, Life's a Bitch, and of course, some of the later ones. The reasons I held off from listening to this album was merely because of rather stupid reasons, but at least I'm now making up for it. This is a great album. To me, after catching Raven live last year, and with them starting off with Take Control, you know, it has become my favorite song off of this album. It's a kick-ass, balls-to-the-wall rocker with an undeniable hook. If there is one thing that Raven are great at, is with writing hooks and catchy choruses that fits their wild, insane brand of metal. From there, Mind Over Metal is classic Raven. The same is said for the title track, Break the Chain, Take It Away, and Athletic Rock, which is how Raven describes their style. But what I feel is the album's muscle are with the tracks Run Silent, Run Deep, which has an awesome middle break showcasing John's ways of giving a dark atmosphere by providing some cool bass lines. The fast and loose, hung, drawn, and quartered, and Seek and Destroy. Should not be confused with the Metallica song, as it is very different. The only song here that I find to be not as upbeat as the others is Sledgehammer Rock. Still, a fun, catchy rocker. There really isn't anything wrong to be found on this album. While I'm still figuring out where I'll place this in my ranking of favorite Raven albums, it's definitely going to be placed somewhere in my top 5 or top 10, depending on how, where things come about, After this, Raven would then play with Metallica and began starting to move away from Neat Records by signing with Megaforce. But once the word got out that Neat were thinking about cashing in on Raven's run by wanting to release a best of, Raven got back by deciding to record a live album, which ends up turning into the classic Live at the Inferno live record. But more on that story at another time. So, there you go. 40 years for All for One. If you're one of those who had cut your teeth on this album from day one, if they are positive or negative, you can leave them all in the comment section below. But if you haven't heard this album, if you're now getting into Raven and want to know what is a great place to start, first, go with the first two, and then go with this one. So with that, this is Henry Thrashhead saying I am out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.